Today is Sunday, March 15th, 2020, which means it's a Sunday. Hello, fiendlings, how the hell are you? I've been away for a while, mostly trying to get my life under control as I attempted to hold down two jobs, both with startups, and keep the roof over my head. Well, after 13 months, both startups kind of hit, and I had to make a decision as to what I was going to do. I attempted to keep both jobs for a while, but I couldn't write, record, or do anything well. In short, I was half-assing everything because of lack of time and energy. To get to the damned point, I'm now down to one job and trying to rebuild my routine. The bad news is, of course, I now have just a couple of months to bring a software product to market. It's a lot of work, especially for one person. But I'll make it happen. Regardless, it's going to mean a lot of hours and more 7-day work weeks. The good news is that I should be back on the writing horse in a major way soon. That sounds strange, but in truth I can only focus on so many things at once, and if I'm constantly being interrupted by having to manage folks or handle production emergencies, it's impossible for me to get anything done. It's March of 2020, I'm writing 2 novels at the same time, don't ask, and working toward things rather than simply reacting to them. Should make life a little bit better for me. Now, I think we need to talk about the elephant in the room. I know everyone is a bit anxious regarding COVID-19, and I myself was on a plane just a couple of days ago. I'm in self-quarantine until further notice, mainly because my immune system is not the strongest known to humankind, and I'm more susceptible to respiratory issues, but, more importantly, because I might have it and could get other folks sick. Just a precaution. One reason I'm back on the air, so to speak, is that I think the world needs a little more entertainment, and we all need a break from the news. With that in mind, I'm going to kick the podcast back into gear and unroll a few older tales of mine while I work up new stories. And because I was born with poor taste, I decided to bring you Lamashtu. What the hell is a Lamashtu, you ask? Nearly a decade ago, I found myself researching Mesopotamian and Babylonian myths for my Garagas Children's series. Many of the myths are lost, or modern humanity has mere fragments of them. In many cases, the references seem to be a recursive lead to many dead ends. I kept coming across the one named Lamashtu. The entry was fascinating in its ridiculously broad definition of the ancient folklore. I thought it was kind of an interesting idea for a story at some point, so I filed it away. Fellow horror author Ed Lorne, the twisted genius that gave us Life After Dane, a fantastically nasty little novel that will make you cringe, invited me to submit to a horror anthology he was putting together. The anthology's theme? The reimagining of classic horror movies. He wanted the tales to be inspired by those classics, but not adhere to them in any way. Without knowing how it would work or why, I chose Karloff's The Mummy. I was ashamed to admit at the time that I'd never even seen the Karloff version. If you've only seen the Brendan Fraser version or Garaga Help You, Tom Cruise, you owe it to yourself to go check out the classic movie version. Trust me, it's creepy. Anyway, I didn't want to set my mummy in Egypt. That's a well-worn setting. So I decided to go to South America once I did a little research. Now I want to visit the place I researched. Maybe in some other life. The anthology never happened, but Lamashtu was written and accepted and eventually recorded as a little audiobook. That was years ago. For the next couple of weeks, I'm bringing you my version of The Mummy. I hope you enjoy. Be safe, have a great week, and we'll talk again real soon. Here's episode 1 of Lamashtu.
A large bird circled overhead. John watched as it dipped down and dove before pulling back up to glide on the thermals. In the past week, he'd seen dozens fly like that. Or perhaps it was the same bird. He smiled at the thought. A melodious laugh broke the spell, and he turned to look at Steph Harvey. A manic smile lit her face. "John, aren't you supposed to be more interested in what's beneath your feet?" John grunted and pointed to the large mound of black and white dirt at the base of the cliff. "I think I've seen enough of that already." Shaking her head, Steph walked to the timbers holding up the entrance to the small cave. Her long ponytail bounced against her back with each step. John sighed, took one last look at the albatross performing its aerial acrobatics, and followed. John passed by the LED lamps fastened to the black rock walls. Whenever he entered the cave, he felt as though he were being swallowed by some prehistoric creature. The cave had taken the 5 archaeologists and 20 Peruvians weeks to dig. They'd had to cut timbers and drag them back from the forest using a truck to prevent cave-ins. Placing them had been hell. John was certain his back would never be the same. Stooped over to keep from hitting his head, his lower back twinged as if in reminder. He followed Steph through the 50 feet of rocky ground. His hands were covered in scratches, nicks, and barely healed blisters. They ached from the weeks of labor, and even now, when they weren't doing anything, they reminded him of their abuse. He entered the small 6x5 chamber and dropped to one knee. Linton was up against the wall, his black, sweat-covered skin shining beneath the garish LED light. John grinned as he saw Linton's wide, toothy smile. "Where are we?" he asked. Linton pointed with his finger at the hole in the floor. "We hit something." John raised an eyebrow. "Something? Can you be a little less specific, Linton?" Steph rolled her eyes. "He means we hit stone." The big archaeologist shook his head. "What kind of stone?" Linton's grin grew. "The kind this place is not made of." The lithe man held up his left hand. In his palm was a piece of chipped sandstone. John nodded. "Okay then, you're the prime digger, Mr. Geologist. I'm used to sifting through sand and dirt, not sandstone. So what do we do now?" Linton shrugged. "We dig, just a little more carefully." "Do you want me to call in the diggers?" John asked. Linton shook his head. "Nope, they did the heavy lifting to get us in here. Now we need to be careful." Steph pulled a small spade and hammer from the leather pouch hanging at her waist. She nodded toward Linton. "He and I will continue excavating, at least until we get past the sandstone. But I wanted you to see this." She pointed down into the hole. John raised an eyebrow before shuffling over and getting on his hands and knees to peer into the dark hole. Steph pointed a flashlight. John waited for his eyes to adjust and then stared in wonder. Most of the dirt had been cleared away from a sandstone block. Squiggles and shapes were carved into its surface. Unlike most civilizations that predated writing, the denizens of Norte Chico hadn't even carved stick figures to describe their daily lives. Since they had disappeared without leaving any traces of their language, it would be impossible to decipher the glyphs. "That's writing," he said, "or shapes." Steph slapped him on the back, and the big man twitched. "You got it, Big John. Writing." He raised his head and stared at Linton. "Linton, I want pictures, and I mean as many as you can take." The wiry man nodded. "Already on it. As soon as we clear away the rest of the dirt, we're going to photograph the shit out of it." "Steph?" John turned toward her, his face lit in a wide smile. "Have you checked for gaps?" She shrugged. "After we hit it and started clearing away the dirt, I dug a little on the left side." She pointed into the hole, but John didn't take his eyes from hers. "John, that's not a lid. I think it's just a cap on a deeper hole." "So it's not a sarcophagus?" She shook her head. "I don't think so. I could be wrong, of course, but I think it's a kind of headstone or tombstone." "That tracks," John said. He grinned at Linton. "I want pictures sent over as soon as you have them. What other gear do we need?" Steph and Linton traded stares. Finally, she spoke. "I think we're good. We might need Blanco and Alonzo. They've got the best hands." John shuffled back on his elbows and pushed himself into a sitting position. He wiped a sheen of sweat off his forehead. "I'll get them in here. I reckon we can get the ground radar in here to see how deep it is." Linton shook his head. "No, John, we're just going to have to dig." "Right," John said. "Picks. Then get to it." His grin returned. "Norte Chico, you're going to give us something today." Steph giggled and handed the piece of broken sandstone to John. "You might want to keep this, boss." He slipped the shard in his shirt pocket. "Good job, guys." As he turned and walked back through the cave to the arid Andean air, the shard bumped against his chest. He couldn't stop grinning. This was the greatest find of the new millennium. A civilization that left no words and almost no pottery had left something they could study. Finally. All the bickering between the different archaeologists since the 90s could finally be put to rest. And what was in the hole? Was it a burial site? A time capsule of sorts? John walked into the bright sun and headed toward the tented camp just 50 yards away. Big John sat before the campfire. The yellow crescent moon hung low over the mountains, just beginning its ascent. The last rays of sunlight had disappeared over an hour ago, and the air had turned cold. Sitting in front of the crackling flames, he felt warm and elated. Steph and Linton had dug the rest of the morning and into the evening. Blanco and Alonzo had joined them with small sweepers, tiny shovels, and cameras. Each layer of sediment they removed from around the cap had been placed in containers for dating. The team didn't have access to radiocarbon dating in the field, so they had to look at the sediment itself. Linton had taken a sediment core when they first began excavation. The man-made cave was at least 4,000 years old. The denizens of Norte Chico had flourished between 3,500 and 1800 BCE, which meant this cave was made somewhere around their demise. The idea the team might have found this civilization's last monument set his stomach aflutter. The rest of the day, he'd written in his dig journal and continued to categorize specimens found during the excavation. Although the Supracaral peoples had been pre-ceramic, they'd found fossilized wooden carvings of Andean birds like the albatross and the condor. All through the Andes, the ancient peoples had worshipped the birds as gods. The symbol of the animals were usually held sacred and appeared on structures rather than wooden casts. Burying them, however, seemed like an act of heresy. John had searched through the reports and journals of all the other digs throughout history and could find no evidence or reports of the symbols being buried. Ever. That meant this cave was truly unique. And it wasn't just one or two of the wooden casts. As they had dug through the base of the hill, they'd found dozens of them. The symbols were nearly identical, as were the shapes. The fact they buried them seemed to indicate their use as a ward of protection or some other holy intent. John wasn't certain what it meant. Once the cataloging was finished, he'd sat in a chair near the fire and continued writing notes. The solar batteries had stored more than enough energy to run all the equipment, including the heaters, but he much preferred a real fire. "Enjoying your rest, boss?" John turned his head and watched as Steph crouched by the fire. She rubbed her hands as she stared into the flames. "Finally got cold, huh?" She smiled. "You could say that, boss. Damn chilly tonight." He nodded. "You look cleaned up now." "Yeah," she said. "Portable showers for the win. But now I'm freezing." "How's Linton?" She shrugged. "A little peaked. I think we dug a little too long today. Alonzo and Blanco are exhausted too." She walked to a chair set up across from him and pulled it closer to the fire. Steph sat down and shivered in the cool air. "You look at the photos?" He nodded. "The glyphs came out perfect. I got their dimensions fed into the computer. If Willett's algorithms find a match, we'll know about it tomorrow. Or the next day." "That little bastard. How much you think he gets paid to do math while the rest of us sacrifice our bodies?" Big John laughed. Steph loved being an archaeologist, but she was always ready to point out discrepancies in pay. Dr. Michael Willett had created a program some years back that used information about shapes to compare different artifacts from different civilizations. Willett's thesis had been an argument that was part Jungian and part common sense. Disparate civilizations contained many similar structures, glyphs, and construction. Willett's work sought to combine the idea of the collective unconscious with that of ancient civilizations communicating with one another. For instance, why were the Aztec pyramids so much like the ziggurats found in Mesopotamia? Why were certain symbols found in peoples that were separated by vast oceans? Willett had been written off as a crank, but his algorithmic work had netted him several contracts, including one with Homeland Security. At least Willett had been kind enough to offer archaeologists free use of their system as opposed to what he charged the feds. Despite his insistence he was an anthropologist, Willett had never been in the field nor stepped out of the United States. The single time John had met him, Willett had come off as an arrogant bastard. Talented, perhaps, but very arrogant. If Willett's program found a match, however, John would make sure the program got its due in the journals. Steph picked up a metal poker. She nudged the logs with its tip. The fire crackled and a shower of sparks flew into the air. "What do you think, boss? It's something unique, right?" John nodded. "I can't find any accounts similar to what we found. In the few burial sites where bodies were recovered, the symbols for the gods were found on the shroud itself or or buried with the body. And even then, only a single piece of stone or wood was found that had the carving on it. This is strange. Unique, Steph said as she stared into the fire. I don't understand why they dug the cave. This post is over 3 kilometers from where we found the pictogram. Why would they create this so far from their city? The pictogram, he said to himself. 3 weeks before their funding was due to expire for Corral Site 376, Steph and Linton had found a chamber beneath the Corral Temple. The temple was little more than 7 feet high and had been very small compared to other sites. The ground-penetrating radar had revealed the small space beneath the mound. It had taken nearly a week to excavate it without disturbing the temple itself. What they'd found was a stone wall with a few symbols and lines. The symbols were of mountains and hills. The lines seemed to be a road or path. Big John had instantly recognized it as a map, but the pictogram didn't reveal any hints about what the map led to. It had taken most of a day for him to put the landmarks on the map with those surrounding the temple. Once he had, finding the path had been relatively simple. Unlike other South American sites in the Amazon, the arid Andes climate was superb for preservation. The Supe Corral tribe had buried the map, and it had led to an artificial cave. John couldn't imagine how long it had taken them to dig through the rock and create the chamber. Luckily for his crew, they hadn't done such a thorough job of filling it back up. You know, Steph, the cave is still within viewing distance of the temple. What? She asked and turned toward him. John pointed toward the desert beyond the campsite. The temple where we found the pictogram. It's within sight. Sure, if it was still daylight. He rolled his eyes. No, Steph. What I mean is, I know what you mean, she said between chattering teeth. She stood up and moved the chair closer to the fire. Once seated, she rubbed her arms. You think they did that on purpose? Why not? He asked. There are other soft spots in this hill they could have dug. They could have even put it on the other side. Instead, they put it on the eastern side, facing the temple, but not facing the city itself. She cocked her head and sighed. Okay, but what's your point? John grinned. Not sure I have one. Just more information to put in the journal. Great, more questions. She poked the fire and another shower of sparks rose toward the stars. This is the only expedition I've been on that has no answers. He nodded. But tomorrow we remove the cap. Then maybe we'll find something out. Maybe, she agreed. Big John stood and stared toward the west. Somewhere in the dark, the temple stood watch over the cave. He shrugged off the thought. I'm turning in. Fair enough, he said, and walked toward his tent. The birds in the sky blotted out the sun. A flock of thousands swirled and soared through the air. A tornado of feathers and avian screams slowly descended toward the desert floor. In the distance, the temple glowed with yellow and crimson. As the birds moved closer to the ground, the temple's glow increased. The world shook when the flock surrounded the temple, hiding it from view. A bright beam of light flowed upward into the sky. The birds flapped their wings as one, and the air thundered. The ground shook again as the thousands of birds flew off in different directions. Unobscured, the temple was the color of bright sand, etchings and glyphs clearly visible on its walls. In the distance, a group of people wearing loincloths marched toward the temple. As they neared the building, they each became distinct. Heads bowed, 37 men and women walked in single file through the entrance. A lone condor circled them, and then entered behind them. The temple groaned, and the ground quaked. Light began streaming from the outer walls, and then the world became a single flash of white. John opened his eyes and stared into the morning darkness. He was sweating in the cold air. He shrugged back into the sleeping bag and slept once more. The coffee was hot and bitter, just the way he liked it. John sipped it as he stared toward the desert. He could make out the temple in the distance, but only because of the bright blue flags that rippled in the wind. From so far away, they were little more than blue dots. He stretched and powered on his laptop. He opened a console and called up the mail client. Another sip of coffee warmed his belly against the morning chill. It had been a cold night, and until the sun managed to climb a bit higher in the sky, he'd be able to see his breath. He stared at the screen while he finished the hot drink. He looked through the new emails and found one from Willett. He opened it and scanned through it. All Willett said was that the dimensions had been fed into the program, and he hoped he would have results in a day or two. John sighed and drank the dregs from the cup. He shook the mug, and a few droplets and grounds slipped out onto the desert floor. He stood from his chair and walked toward the cooking fire. As he neared the coffee pot, the green tent a few yards away shook. He smiled as he refilled his cup. "Rise and shine, Steph," he said in a cheerful voice. The tent flap opened, and Steph stepped out of the tent. His grin disappeared. Her face was pale, and she was shivering. "You feeling okay?" She groaned and zipped up her black fleece. "I've been better," she said, and spat a wad of phlegm. "Guess I'm coming down with something." He nodded. "I can take care of things. Why don't you head back to bed?" Steph shook her head and sat down in front of the fire. The flames had mostly died off, leaving white ash and a furnace of coals. "I'm not going to miss taking off that cap." She looked up at him with a wan smile. "I want to see what's in there." "I understand that, but you look like shit." "Yep," Steph said as she eyed the coffee. "Any more of that left?" He nodded, walked to the camp table, pulled off a clean mug, and filled it from the kettle. He handed the steaming cup to her. She cradled it in her hands, sniffing the warm liquid. "I'll check on Alonzo and Blanco," he said, and headed toward their tents. The Peruvian diggers were both amateur geologists. Like most of the dig staff, they were diligent, hard workers who were getting paid a ridiculously low wage for the expedition. And yet, the amount was gratuitous compared to what they could make in the cities. "Blanco?" he called as he approached the man's tent. The only reply was a cough and a groan. "Señor, ¿cómo está?" The tent shook, and then Blanco poked his head out. His close-cropped, black, gray-streaked hair looked unhealthy in the morning light. John frowned. The man's face was pale, just like Steph's, and his eyes were sunken into his skull. "You okay, man?" Blanco's mouth opened in a wide smile that showed off his dingy teeth. "Si, Señor Verescara. Just a little under the weather." The archaeologist nodded. "Same with Steph. You guys party late or something?" Blanco shook his head. "No, señor. Too much digging." "Well, if you need to sleep in." "I'm awake," he said. "No need for more sleep. Tiempo por trabajo." Big John nodded. "All right. I'll get Alonzo." "Gracias," Blanco said, and disappeared back into his tent. John stepped past Blanco's tent and to Alonzo's. "Señor?" "I heard," a husky voice said from inside the tent. "Por la momentito." John turned and headed back to the fire. Steph was sitting up and drinking her coffee. Her pale complexion had at least warmed a bit. "Better?" "Much," Steph said. "You going to join us for the cap?" "Is there room?" She shrugged. "Probably not for all of us." John sighed. "Linton will fit. I'll wait outside with the camera, or until you call me in there." Steph giggled. "Must suck to be the boss." He shrugged. "Sometimes, but somebody's got to control you lunatics." John had dragged a portable chair and a portable table to the mouth of the cave. Alonzo and Blanco, both looking as though they'd gone 10 rounds with the flu and lost, had managed to carry the cooler and tools. Linton had joined them. Like the others, he looked under the weather. With John's back in bad shape, they'd insisted he sit on his ass. Big John sat with his laptop on his knees. The portable satellite link lay next to his chair. Every now and then, the tiny dish atop it would whir and move. He watched the video feed on the computer. Linton wore a hat with a portable cam attached to it. If John couldn't be inside the cave, at least he'd have a live view of it. The video swung in dizzying jerks as Linton helped the rest of the crew loosen the cap's edges. The previous day, they'd cleaned off the dirt and begun digging down beneath the cap. They had to be careful. They'd already broken off a tiny shard from the strange stone-like marker. After so many thousands of years, there was no telling just how fragile it was. He turned up the volume on the computer and heard heavy breathing and chattering. The camera was focused on Steph's face. Her smile was infectious. Well, boss, here we go. The camera tilted away from her and peered down at the circular stone cap. He watched as 4 pairs of hands scraped beneath the stone. The cap moved just the slightest bit. Heave! Steph shouted. The cap rose from the ground. A rush of air hissed out from beneath the stone. The camera swung as the group carefully removed the cap to a small cart in the tunnel. The cart was covered in burlap and cotton to protect the stone. They carefully laid it on the cart, and then the camera swung up to Steph's flushed, sweat-dripping face. Her smile was even larger. Well, boss, come and get it. John grinned. He closed the laptop and rose from the chair. With careful steps, he made his way into the cave. Steph and Linton were hunched over the cart. Alonzo and Blanco had already made their way back into the chamber. Big John offered his huge hand, and Linton shook it with a grin. Good job, guys. We got it all on film. He took the cart's handle. All right, I've got cold drinks and sandwiches. You guys ready for 'em? Linton dabbed a handkerchief at his brow. Not for me. I want to see what's in this hole. Steph nodded. Same. Get that thing out of here, though, before one of us crushes it. Got that right, John said. He tipped his wide-brimmed hat and slowly pulled the cart through the tunnel. Its wheels ground against straight gravel and dirt, but he didn't have to pull very hard to keep it moving. Once out of the cave and into the sunlight, he dragged the cart beside his chair. John stared at the cap in the bright sunlight. The glyphs seemed to glow. He picked up the high-resolution digital camera and snapped pictures. Once he caught the entire face of the cap, he took close-ups of each glyph. After photographing every single inch of its surface, he flipped the mode to video and did the same. If nothing else, the images would be fed into Willett's program, in addition to filling out the expedition journal. He put down the camera and covered the artifact with a reflective blanket. He didn't want the sun damaging the find. Big John opened his laptop, and the video feed immediately jumped on the screen. Linton was bent over the hole, his LED headlamp shining down into the dark. John watched as small shovels cleared and dug more dirt out of the hole. A clicking sound caught his attention as Blanco's hands moved back from the hole. Brush? Blanco said in a shaky voice. A small wooden-handled brush appeared in the corner of the screen. Blanco's fingers took it, and the camera view was obscured as the digger bent over. Dios mío, the man breathed. What is it? Linton said from off-camera. Blanco's face stared up. I think we have a body. Dusk was fast approaching. John sat beneath the field canopy. The breeze had picked up a bit, and the hemp cloth wavered in the wind. Blanco, Alonzo, and Steph had already wandered off to their tents. The surprise of the find was enough to keep them upright until late afternoon, but fatigue had finally caught up with them. Spread out on the field table was the bundle they removed from the hole, and several other artifacts buried with it. Condor and albatross carvings had been found with the body. The carvings were much more intricate than what they'd found at the cave's mouth. The birds still held some hints of crimson color. John wondered what kind of dye they'd used. Whatever it was, it had managed to survive thousands of years in the ground. While the others rested, he had taken photos of each piece. As the team unearthed the body, Linton had taken pictures of the carvings and shrouded bundle. They would be filed with the rest. The bundle. John stared at the 5-foot oblong wrapping of cloth. Black and white grains of dirt had permeated the fabric so heavily he was certain it was all that was holding the wrapping together. There was little doubt what was inside the cloth. It was human-shaped. But unlike other Norte Chico mummies, this one was in terrible shape. The denizens of the Norte Chico civilization had mummified their dead either by taking corpses apart and reassembling them, stuffing the corpse with vegetable matter, slathering them with mud, or drying the body cavity and dressing it up. But in those instances, the body wasn't wrapped. It was preserved in a wooden casing. The only bodies they found wrapped were those of children. Bart, as Steph had named it, hadn't been encased. The corpse had been hastily wrapped and then dropped into the hole. The holy carvings of the albatross and condor were placed at various depths around the body before they filled it. John knew this was something unique. The Norte Chico civilization was hardly understood, but this further muddied the intellectual waters. He couldn't wait for the anthropological community to start arguing with itself once the find was published. It would be bedlam. He fought the urge to touch the mummy. The team had preserved it as best they could, including using a sling to raise it from the hole. It was important not to touch it with bare hands for fear of introducing oils onto the wrappings. John yawned. His body ached. If it was the beginning of the same crap that the rest of the team had, things were going to get pretty bad around the camp. With the exception of Blanco and Alonzo, the Peruvian workforce had left last week. Once the heavy digging was finished, there had been little reason to have them around. The problem was, without any backup, he had to make sure he could take care of his people. If that became a problem, they'd have to radio the nearest camp, which was 15 kilometers away. Due to lack of funding for his wild goose chase, they'd been forced to share a truck with the city expedition, and they were using it. Now for the first time, he regretted not demanding an additional vehicle. The daylight finally left. The solenoids in the LED lamps triggered, and the small lanterns lit up with white light. The mummy and the artifacts glowed. With a sigh, John fastened a heavy tarp over the table. He rubbed his eyes and walked around the canopy and shut off the lights. No reason to burn the energy from the solar batteries. The darkness crept in as each LED flicked out. He yawned again and checked the fire. They had eaten a meal of beans and salted pork stew earlier. Although the team was still excited over the find, the fatigue of the flu or whatever the hell it was they had finally took its toll. The fire was nothing but ash and coals now. Convinced it would burn itself out, he headed toward his tent in the growing darkness. The sound of something moving caught his ears, and he whipped around. His eyes had adjusted to the night, but he saw nothing. The sound came again, and he turned toward the canopy. A slight breeze ruffled the tarp's edges. He let out a breath and smiled as he opened the tent flap, stepped inside, and undressed. Beneath the tarp, something moved.